Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to the Web Talk, COVID-19 and the Future of Our Cities. My name is Angie Fife. I'm the Executive Director at ICLEI USA, and it's our pleasure to co-host this web series with the University Alliance Ruhr. A few housekeeping notes for our attendees. You're encouraged to submit your questions and thoughts through the question box towards the bottom of the GoToWebinar control panel. This web talk and all of the presentation materials will be distributed again to all of our registrants at the conclusion of the webinar. I'd like to take just a couple of seconds to introduce you to ICLEI. ICLEI is a global network of local governments and regional governments. We serve our members through 22 offices around the world. We are on the web at ICLEI_USA. So if you are doing some social media today and you'd like to reach out to us during this web talk, we'd be happy to hear from you and follow your work. The reason that we are interested in the green architecture topic of today is ICLEI's 5 pathways, all touch green architecture. Our pathways are low emission development, nature-based solutions, equity, resilient development, and circular economy, all of which we will touch on, I'm sure, through our distinguished panel of experts today. It's my pleasure now to turn this over to Peter, our co-host with the Alliance Ruhr. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Angie, and thank you in ICLEI as well as the German Center for Research and Innovation for co-hosting our event today. My name is Peter Rosenbaum, and I am the Executive Director of the University Alliance Ruhr office here in New York. Our alliance is a regional consortium of Ruhr University Bochum, TU Dortmund University, and the University of Duisburg-Essen. All 3 of them are located in Germany's Ruhr area. There was once the cradle of the coal mining and steel industry and has been in transition over the past decades and become a hotspot of science and innovation. So the topic of the future of our cities is very much at the core of the Ruhr area's identity as Europe's 3rd largest metropolitan area, and if you wish, a huge urban lab. With today's conversation and those that will follow in the fall, we want to look a bit closer at the present and future of our cities through the prism of what the pandemic has taught us and what some of the pre-existing conditions are that COVID-19 has exposed. For these conversations, we bring together practitioners and researchers, as well as city officials and representatives of NGOs from both sides of the Atlantic. We have a great panel of experts today, but before I introduce them, let me quickly turn it over to Ben Brisch, who is the director of both the German Center for Research and Innovation here in New York and the North America office of the German Academic Exchange Service, the DAAD. Ben?
Hello, everybody. My name is Benedikt Brisch. Thank you for introducing me. And as director of the German Center for Research and Innovation, the German abbreviation is DWIH, or if you wish, DWIH. The DWIH is located here in New York, and it is my pleasure and honor to welcome you here on behalf of our center, because today's virtual web talk is hosted by the DWIH together with our valued partners, the University Alliance Ruhr and the Local Governments for Sustainability, ICLEI. And I'd like to welcome and thank the participating distinguished experts as panelists. Our center, the DWIH, was founded on the initiative of the German Federal Foreign Office, which is currently promoting 5 such centers around the world in Sao Paulo, New Delhi, Moscow, Tokyo, and here in New York. The goal of our center is to bring together scientists and innovators from Germany and the US in order to solve questions of the future on a global level. Today's topic, COVID-19 and the future of our cities, is surely such a question. And now it's my honor and pleasure to hand over the floor to the German Consul General, Mr. David Gill, to whom we are very grateful because we know him as a long-standing promoter of science, and know that in his work he gives transatlantic scientific cooperation a key role, I think, in the relations between our countries. Mr. Gill, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ben Brisch. Thank you, Peter Rosenbaum. Guten Tag, guten Morgen to everybody. Good morning. I'm very glad to be with you this morning as the representative of Germany here in New York. The University Alliance Ruhr and the German Center for Research and Innovation are important partners for us. And it isn't by chance that we work in the same building, the German House. However, the Corona pandemic interrupted this workplace sharing for several months. It didn't interrupt our cooperation. But the Corona pandemic also changed this city. You all know it, you all experienced it. This bustling place was quiet and empty and still is quieter and emptier than it was before. And it changed so many concepts of how we interact and speak with each other. Our online gathering today is just one example. COVID-19 will probably be remembered as a time when everyone had to physically distance and to isolate. But hopefully it will also be remembered as a time when we discovered and embraced new ways of interaction and dialogue. Dialogue is a human necessity and a human desire, and we might experience this in these days particularly. And it is probably the most valuable tool of a diplomat. Currently, we can see this very clearly in the transatlantic relations. We need to discuss common interests as well as areas of dissent in order to strengthen the alliance of free and democratic countries for the well-being of many more. But there are too many misunderstandings and unilateral approaches due to a lack of exchange and dialogue, sometimes even speechlessness. Interaction and dialogue is more important today than perhaps ever before. And it needs not only diplomats and politicians to foster this exchange, but also the scientists and the research community, economists and businesses, artists and cultural institutions, and the civil society as such. Therefore, I'm grateful that ICLEI, our partner today, is doing exactly that, bringing together stakeholders on a local and regional level, making dialogue and the exchange of experiences possible. While the content of a dialogue is important, the environment of exchange and creative discourses is crucial as well. So I'm excited to hear about the ideas for the future of our cities this morning. Many people think New York will never be the same after the pandemic. And while this might be true, we have to take the chance to make this city and all the other big cities better places for the people and the environment. I'm looking forward to an inspiring conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Consul General Gill, and thank you, Ben, for your introductions. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers. Both our first speaker and moderator is Alexander Marescu. For over a decade, Alex has worked in disaster reduction and urban resilience, beginning with the United Nations in 2009 in program coordination, aid effectiveness, and resilience. Alex received his PhD at the New School for Social Research and then worked in academia. And in 2015, the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction nominated him to promoter of the UN Making Cities Resilient campaign. In 2016, Alex founded Resilient City, LLC, a global consulting firm that supports municipal and national governments, the private sector, and international organizations on evaluating risk and resilience, crafting policy and action plans, and implementation. Since 2019, Alex has served as a senior consultant for private sector engagement for resilience at the World Bank's Climate Risk Early Warning Systems Initiative. And in 2019, Resilient City branched out operations to include social resilience, supporting the World Economic Forum and the city of Jersey City. He was selected as policy fellow for the forum's Healthy Cities and Communities multi-city platform. Our next speaker, Wolfram Höfer. Wolfram is an associate professor at the Rutgers University Department of Landscape Architecture, and Wolfram also serves as director of the Rutgers Center for Urban Environmental Sustainability. He is a licensed architect and received his PhD from the Technical University of Munich in 2000. At Rutgers, Wolfram redeveloped and developed numerous community outreach projects in the field of adaptive reuse of brownfields, urban resiliency, and infrastructure. His research also looks at different cultural interpretations of landscapes on both sides of the Atlantic and how they influence public participation processes, as well as professional approaches towards planning and design solutions for adaptive reuse of brownfields. Josh Radoff is a senior vice president with WSP, and he leads WSP's Build Ecology practice. He consults with owners and designers on sustainable development projects at the building community or campus scale, including those pursuing high-level goals such as net zero energy and carbon. Josh was the founder of the sustainability group YRNG. He is a co-founder of the advocacy group Green Home New York City and a co-chair of the ULI Colorado Health Places Committee and is a LEED fellow. He holds master's degrees in mechanical and electrical engineering from the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm and Columbia University in New York. And Josh also teaches a class at the University of Colorado in Boulder on decarbonizing the built environment. Last but not least, Sebastian Schlecht is an architect with an urban design focus, and he has worked for the city of Essen, Germany, Ruhr area since 2010. In 2015, Sebastian took over the project management for the Green Capital of Europe Essen 2017 campaign, and today works on implementing the goals of this campaign at the intersection of environment, mobility, climate protection, and climate adaptation, and the green, gray, and blue infrastructure. Sebastian is the founder of the project LaLa Ruhr, it's spelled LALA.RUHR, the landscape lab of the Ruhr metropolis, and he is also a member of the initiative City Makers Europe China. And since 2007, he has worked in architectural education and urban development for children and young people through the association Jugendarchitektur Stadt, Youth Architecture City. Thank you all very much for coming. This was a very long introduction. I'm thrilled to have all of you on board, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Just a reminder, and to reiterate what Angie said already, you can ask questions by using the questions box, and if you want to chat, if you want to comment, use the chat function, but use the question box primarily for your questions. And I'm turning it over to Alex. Thank you very much for being part of today's conversation. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, my thanks to the Consul General of Germany and to ICLEI and to Peter and his team for all their great work in setting this up. I would say we just jump right into the topic here. And so we're looking at essentially how cities behave with stress. And that stress can come from several different factors. And I think we'd all agree that the way we looked at cities, how we design them, how we socially organize them, how we economically organize them, how we look at inclusivity, essentially, I think, and the panelists can agree or disagree with this in the course of the conversation, but I would say we all somehow neglected to look at pandemics. If we look at, for example, one of the guiding documents of the world when we're talking about risk reduction and resilience, that document is called the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. That's the United Nations global guiding policy on how to reduce risk, especially for cities. In that document, it's named over 30 or 32 times the questions of risk coming from pandemics. And yet, over the past decade, as we've thankfully looked at how dynamic and innovative cities have become and how politically and socially and economically they've become. We seem to have left this topic of pandemics to like the public health officials, or we've left them to ministries of health. We haven't properly included that into discussions on urban policy. This could be a tremendous learning moment for us. And I think this is something we're going to learn from our distinguished panelists today. So I'd like to jump right into a couple of the questions. And we're going to look at, in general, how we need to rethink or redesign our sort of mental imagery of cities. So my first question goes to Sebastian, and then I'll moderate some responses from Josh and Wolfram. But how do we rethink the role of green infrastructure in a post-COVID world, but in which factors that we need to be aware of that link public health and green infrastructure? What does that link look like, and how do we need to rethink it? Sebastian, let's start with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Alexander, for that interesting topic and for meeting us here. So the idea of green as a core of human life is nothing really new. The question is how we live in cities and which habits we have in our all-day life to relate to green, and what impact has green infrastructure on our life. And this idea of climate change, climate adaptation is already known, and we discuss green infrastructure in that framework still since a longer time. But that is more an abstract discussion, and what COVID-19 did is it changed our habits from one day to the next with a worldwide lockdown, and so people started very fast to change their all-day ways, where they walk, where children play, which places they were at, and so we changed completely the view and the perspective to our surroundings. And I think if you get the framework and if we get the change of perspective, the climate change and the pandemic, so this is overlapping a lot. And if we define this public health or the health issue as a personal health and also as a society health aspect, the green spaces can play a major role in that surrounding of the urban environment. And I think the main aspect is the performance of that green. So how does it feed our needs? Is it accessible for everybody? So can people access green that is performing very well? And the aspect of performance of green is I also mean in terms of social quality of life, but also in noise reduction and heat and rainwater and all that topics. So I like to define the performance in the holistic view. And if the city is becoming more dense, we need even more that high performance of natural systems to preserve that livelihood of our urban environment for the people. And in times of people get affected by a virus, this still counts even more. And maybe the urban environment more has to provide more services in that lockdown time as in our usual old life. Let's say old life. Maybe it won't come back. So
pre-corona life.
Yeah, pre-corona, post-corona. If we go every day to the supermarket and to go to our job and we fly to our conferences, and we changed all that habits, and we need much more well-performing local green surroundings to become a healthy and person and a healthy society.
I'd like to latch on to this point of the performance of green Josh, looking at the layering of risk and green as a solution to that, I'd like to get your thoughts at again about how we can design for public health.
Yeah, so I wanted to add to a couple of things Sebastian said. I think the idea, most people when they think about green infrastructure, they probably think about stormwater management and using sort of a way that's not just sort of concrete pipes to sort of manage that, which is obviously a very sort of narrow view of that. And the idea of thinking about green infrastructure as this holistic was one of the words, and high performance was a sort of another word that Sebastian mentioned. You know, component of infrastructure is really key. You know, I think once you sort of establish that and you sort of think broadly, like, you know, cities, and I'm just gonna, you know, I think cities and suburbs, and, you know, we'll talk about both of these in concert here. They're gonna have to make, one way to think about it is they're gonna have to make the case to keep people there, keep people from migrating out, and or attract people if they're starting to sort of compete for people who are, you know, moving from one place to another. And one of the best ways to do that is gonna be through green infrastructure, right? The idea that, you know, you should be able to sort of walk out of your whatever apartment house and have a sort of walkable, you know, green sort of healthy place to sort of exist without having to sort of get on a subway or get on a bus and travel several miles to do that. In my mind, you know, every city at this point should be thinking about what infrastructure they can reclaim, underused land that they could reclaim to put into the service of green infrastructure, meaning like parks, you know, right-of-way type measures within a sidewalk, anything, lanes of the street, to then essentially say, you know, this is, I don't need all this anymore. People aren't sort of commuting to work. People aren't sort of driving as much. You know, I have this opportunity to sort of remake this, and I'm going to need to sort of like direct funding, direct planning, do that in a way that I haven't done before. You know, but you know, in terms of like, how do you design for a healthy city? I think that's generally known. It's really, you know, make things greener, make the, you know, create sort of more access to things like healthy foods, places to recreate, better air quality. So there's a lot of elements of that. I think you can sort of like collide this whole thing with the technology aspects that are happening at the same time around things like electrification of vehicles, which we can talk more about. But I think we know what the solutions likely are about how to make cities healthier and suburbs healthier. Now we have like this real impetus to directly plan towards that and make that a high priority.
Thank you, Josh. That's really kind of opens us up to a second topic here, and I was gonna see. It looks like Wolfram has lost a connection. Well, hopefully that he'll patch back in. But you bring in this topic, and I think it's very central to how we address public health and urban design, and that's this whole area of like public realms, parks, plazas. You mentioned right of way. You know, these, as people are moving less and staying at home, the necessity of having a park close by, some sort of public realm for markets, instead of going to big supermarkets or taking mass transit. Clearly, there is a very, there are new ways of looking and structuring public realms. So there are new roles that we have to look here. So I'd like to have Sebastian maybe talk about this. And so how do we look at public realms, not only for public health, but for social inclusion? There's obviously, in the US, we're experiencing a very big moment of social justice. So it's also looking at public realms as a way not only for social inclusion, but inclusion in terms of people who are economically disadvantaged and typically communities of color. Let's start with Sebastian on that one.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alexander. I think that the green spaces we are using, our parks and our urban environments, they got now in a very high stress by many people using it. So we experience it right now here. We have summer holiday and many people did not leave. So the people are all going outside, stay in the green. And so this is like high impact on all that urban spaces. And we notice much more that it's very important that they are working very well to serve the needs of the people, and that they are not only there to look nice. And so there are also two different ways how people go out, because we have people, they have private gardens, they have their private spaces, and they are more staying in their neighborhoods and in their homes. And we have lots of people which don't have private greens, and they go outside and start using it as their living space. So they go with the family, they stay the whole day outside, and we need green that can stay that stress. So our green spaces have to handle that. But at the same time, these green spaces have to be resilient to climate change and with the low maintenance. And so this is a very complex idea of green, because we cannot start maintaining the green spaces more and more and more. And so somehow I believe that our green must be not only the consuming product, but somehow we have to get people to put nature in their commission. So the people need to get very personal identification with nature in front of their door. It's not their own nature, but it is something that they need. They need shadow, they need
shared
open
space.
space.
A shared space or shared green.
Yeah, public space is the shared space, but also people have to find out that it's not only a place to go, they get something back, they get clean air, they get a nice temperature, they get place for their children, for themselves to have a nice day, they can eat food which grows there, and the green space can also reduce risk and heavy rain, storm water, whatever. So this is it's quite a shift of how we as a society look at the green space and the green nature system in our city, and it's growing. So the idea of the green is growing in that holistic view very much, and it takes even more space in outside of our doors, because it's getting more relevant even in front of our door, not only when we reach the park or we reach the green space we go on the weekend. It must just begin in front of our doorstep. We must experience that nature is a part of our city and is serving our quality of life.
Let me link in now Wolfram. We lost him for a second, but we're happy to have him back. Building on what Sebastian said, and also building on what Josh had mentioned in his first response, we're looking at shared spaces. We're looking at public realms as having more function than we perhaps understood in a pre-corona environment. But Josh brought in a really interesting topic, and that is, cities are experiencing sort of an interesting type of flight, and a lot of people are leaving the cities at the moment. It's not driven by necessarily socioeconomic conditions. It's driven largely by public health concerns. And Wolfram, you're an expert in looking at questions of resilience and sustainability, especially for peri-urban and suburban areas. So I'd like to connect these two topics of the importance of sort of the margins of cities, or looking at cities as regions, but how do we get public realms and shared spaces in areas that are less compact and sort of less urbanized as it's classically defined?
Well, thank you, Alexander. And I'm also apologizing that my little computer here doesn't
kind of keeps opting out. So I hope this will survive a little bit. Yes, I live in suburban New Jersey, and next door neighbor was ready to sell the house, and they sold it within a weekend because so many New Yorkers trying to escape the city and trying to be here. And that actually puts a pretty interesting pressure or effort onto the suburban landscape. And if I can have my first slide on that. Because we, with the Center of Urban Environment Sustainability, look into what the role and what the value of the suburban landscape is, and having a different perspective on it and calling it actually a cultural landscape. The suburban landscape is not just the space between all these residential developments, but we want to look at it as a system, and that suburbia is more than just a spatial distribution of economic interests. Kind of that's how it started. And so this is how we look at the suburban landscape, and the approach is to have a comprehensive landscape plan. Can I have my next slide? That we are working with the Middlesex County right now, which is one of these local governments, and saying what are the elements that a suburban landscape needs, and looking at all these different services we talked about stormwater, about recreation, but about farmland, all these different services, but looking at them holistically and trying to understand how all these fit together, and developing an integrated landscape and ecosystem services plan. And that is an approach with a local government to look into all the services that landscape does, and to provide this for the residents with all their different needs, and to come away that only the designated park is that piece of nature that I would go to, but thinking about that the suburban landscape is the space where we fulfill our needs in times of health crisis. And by the way, one of the most shocking things at the beginning of the crisis, that the governor, the governor of New Jersey, who's really, really careful about all of this.
So Wolfram, I think we're losing a bit of your sound quality here. Yeah, we've lost a bit of the sound quality. Why don't we do this? So Josh, let's try to build on what Wolfram was talking about, and since you brought in the topic of suburban spaces, Wolfram is looking at these suburban spaces as a system. And this great example of looking at Rutgers University and Middlesex County, for maybe our North American or international listeners, to give you a bit of an idea, Middlesex County falls largely within the New York metro area. It's about 40 or 45-minute train ride to New York, but in central New Jersey. Josh, how do we build on systems in a suburban environment, and what are the challenges to that?
Sure. So I think, first of all, I sympathize with Wolfram. This is not the first webinar where someone's home internet has malfunctioned that I've seen. So my apologies, and I'll do my best to sort of fill in. But I mean, I think this question about really sort of opens a new question about how suburbs evolve. And I think, you should pick a random suburb and go look on Google Earth at it and look at how much land is essentially like unused. And I think the reason for that is because, hello? Can you hear me, or is that Wolfram?
I think that was Wolfram.
Okay, sorry. Maybe want to mute. Sorry. So yeah, I think once you sort of start looking at that perspective, even cities that are generally progressive, I live in Boulder, Colorado. If you want to sort of choose ours, Wolfram has internet issues. I have a dog that's barking. there's just like opportunities everywhere, even in places that we think are progressive, in large part because suburbs developed as places for people to sort of like not essentially conduct the sort of full sphere of their lives. You know, we had an interview, I was on an interview for a new corporate headquarters in a Midwestern city that wanted to build a new 50-story high-rise. And it, you know, as we were sort of going through the interview process, it really raised the question about, is this essentially how people will continue to conduct their lives, or will a portion of it be this sort of like downtown urban oriented component and the rest being sort of distributed around where people live, right? And are we expecting people to sort of continue to use things like coffee shops as their workplace, even, you know, when things are back together, or are we looking at more sort of co-working, more sort of lower density, but still sort of dense infill type opportunities? And I think the answer is yes, but there still has to be that allure. Most suburbs are oriented around very, you know, gray infrastructure, lots of kind of hardscape, very auto-oriented. And I think if the idea is to sort of like make services, connect services closer to where people are living, that totally changes the dynamic, right? Because roads have to sort of be lower speed. I would say you should take lanes out and dedicate them to electric bicycles, or, you know, sort of like non-auto vehicles in general. But then you have to essentially make that, you have to sort of like do everything you can to sort of take massive parking lots, you know, break them up, sort of like make them green infrastructure in the way that we think about that, and then reclaim more area for more public area for things like recreation. So, you know, the ultimate example of that is the High Line in New York, where, but you know, if you just look at the entire periphery of the New York, you know, essentially the coast of New York, the waterfront of New York, you'll see just like one of the best examples in the world, I think, of taking something where people had no opportunity for interacting with natural spaces and exercise and sort of being healthy, to like creating some of the best in the world, right? And that took sort of dedicated planning, it took dedicated funding. And again, I think this gets me back to many cities are sort of planning already for what makes them healthier, but I think this gives them a different sense of like just reimagining their identity. Like, I'm a suburb and all of my residents need to sort of like get all of those services meaning like exercise and health and parks, here located locally, and I need to sort of like figure out my funding supply and my planning and how I'm going to sort of use land to sort of achieve that. So I think, again, what I'm hoping is one of the main outcomes of this are maybe twofold. One, local governments start structuring themselves to plan for that. And then two, at a federal level, we start thinking about green infrastructure the same way we think about roads, in that, you know, we sort of create massive funding supplies for that kind of infrastructure. And then we sort of direct them through, you know, roads have MPOs or transportation systems have MPOs. We need to think about green infrastructure systems in the same way, where they're big funding supplies that are regionally managed and organized and then implemented at the local level.
Josh, this is a really great point that leads me to a second or third topic for our discussion today. And it's really great that we have Angie Fife from ICLEI here as one of the co-sponsors. In some of my prior work, I've interacted with ICLEI, and that interaction is on the private sector. Cities can't do this alone. You mentioned that the funding may have to come from federal resources. Municipalities, especially now under serious COVID-19 budget stress, they're unable, or not that they're unable, but they really need to look at hospitals. They need to look at emergency management. They have to make sure that their cities' departments of health and human services are well funded and well positioned for that fight against the pandemic. But you know, we kind of lost. We didn't lose, but I mean, things have moved on a little bit. But about a year ago, the Rockefeller Foundation closed the doors on its 100 Resilient Cities program, which was really an amazing, innovative thought space and do space. I would call it a think tank and a do tank. And I had the pleasure to work on a few projects on urban risk in Mexico City and Los Angeles with them. And they really had an interesting approach to this. I would call it a Rolodex for urban policy. They created a thing called a partners platform, which invited private sector entities to really be a much more active contributor to looking at innovative and modernizing urban policies here. So when we're talking about funding, Josh, what are the best ways to advance green infrastructure for public health using the private sector? And I would invite Angie to chime in on this too. Let's maybe start with a contribution from Angie, and then we'll open it up for the others.
Great, thanks for the question, Alex. The work that ICLEI does at the global level around sustainable procurement and economy, I think, is quite important. Of course, because local governments are always looking to ensure a fair and equitable process in terms of procuring services within the city. That process sometimes doesn't particularly lead to innovation, and the ICLEI office in Freiburg actually does a lot of work around sustainable public procurement and procurement for innovation. So I think this is an area in which cities can certainly tap resources to improve. You know, from our perspective, looking at how cities were responding very early in the pandemic here in the United States in the March and April timeline, it truly was a tale of two cities. The responses were quite different. I'll give a good example of a city response. The city of Philadelphia took their resilience staff and they mechanized and mobilized the resilience structure that they already had in place. They took their resilience staff and they had them go out and knock doors and make sure that people had food and medicine and access to power, etc.
The importance of having a chief resilience officer, isn't that one of the greatest learning moments from the Rockefeller platform?
Definitely. I think the other thing that I will give a nod to Philadelphia on as well is that, you know, I think that we recognize that health problems are typically related to not necessarily urban density, but to structural inequities and the attention or inattention and commitment that local leaders have to address those inequities. And so Philadelphia has a very strong social justice program as well. We saw other cities, mid-sized, smaller cities in the US, whose response was to take staff that were working on climate and resilience and either furlough them or move them into some other sort of task. We know of one sort of mid-sized city that sent their staff to the county jail to work in the kitchen overnight. One could argue that that's a resilience strategy, but potentially there could be other uses for that staff. So the private sector certainly can play a role and should play a role, as well as academic institutions. I think there are a lot of good partnerships around academic, private, and public sector as well.
So it looks like we have Wolfram back, and that's a great segue. Thank you, Angie, for that note on private sector engagement. And one little footnote: Philadelphia, I believe, is the only country in the United States whose complete municipal stormwater management plan is based on green infrastructure. They started this around 10 years ago, and they specifically do not use concrete or piping and other systems. It's a very, very interesting case. But let's go back to this idea of partnership very quickly, and then after that we'll go to some of the questions from the listeners. Wolfram, the importance of academia and public and private partnerships here. Can you speak to that, please? Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Here again. Okay. Yes, the importance of academia is I believe, on two levels. The one level, having like what Rutgers does with our extension program, having a direct flow of new knowledge into the municipalities. And the second thing, I believe, is to have a like the center Qs have a partner in the conversation that does not have an interest in it, like a direct interest. One of the challenges in the home rule state of New Jersey, where we have so many small municipalities and very powerful planning firms and engineering firms, is that a center like a university center is not a player, an active player, and is more trusted by the public in many ways. So the contribution of university is providing knowledge with, for example, the water resources program that Rutgers does in terms of providing implementable green infrastructure. But secondly, to be a partner in the local conversation that is allowing for a more fair conversation. And thirdly, what do we do in terms of teaching, like a studio project or innovation? That is a nice test balloon for possible solutions that are clearly in the test phase, but can contribute to the local discussion.
Thank you both. Great. So we're on about the last quarter of the hour here, and I'm just going to ask our partners at ICLEI to maybe share some of the questions that we have from our right honorable listeners throughout the world.
Great, thanks, Alex. We do have a number of good questions here. Maybe I'll read 3 of them out and then let the panelists respond. So the first one, of course, is about this notion of density and a question about, are mega cities like New York doomed? Are they too compressed, too dense? As companies sell their office space or don't renew leases, what will happen to some of these central business districts? That's question 1 for the group. We have a question about twinning of cities and the opportunity for cities to learn from one another. Any good examples of twinning? Perhaps Sebastian can talk about the work that he does with the Urban Transitions Alliance. Let's see. Let's start there and let you take those.
Sebastian.
Yeah, let me start. Thank you. So I have, I think that the question of this dense city as a safe place to live is very, very important to discuss, because there are different views and perspectives on that. So there are places in the world where coronavirus did spread a lot, which are not too dense on the countryside. So it's not a safe place to stay on the countryside if in case of a pandemic. But the dense people in the city, they make you feel more vulnerable. But cities also have more infrastructure. They have more easy access to health systems, and they are much better fitted with support with food stores and supply chains and everything. So that is really an interesting discussion, but I think you cannot solve it. So I think we have to make people on the countryside, you know, the exhibition in New York from Remkola's future in the countryside. Future is in the city, so future is everywhere. So this has to be, we have to solve this problem in the city and outside the city. I think that is not a solution to bring everybody to the countryside or to the suburbs, or we cannot solve it in that way. But I think, Angie, thanks for pointing out UTA. The Urban Transition Alliance is a very great platform for us, which is supported by ICLEI and Mercator Foundation. And we change, especially with cities with an industrial legacy background, we discuss many aspects of a sustainable city, future cities. And I think that is very important to learn from each other, even across borders and across continents, and because we need to get in touch with solutions from different frameworks and which are in widen our horizons. And even in the Asian cities are so full of problems that we can translate to our European cities and American cities. And so this learning process is very important, I believe. We cannot develop by our own in our own surroundings. So we need each other worldwide. So thanks, ICLEI, for your support. Yeah, maybe let's stop on that. So
there was another question here that ICLEI provided us here in the chat, and that is from a comment from Wolfram, who is experiencing some connectivity issues again. The whole question of people fleeing New York, is there data to support the claim? I'll just jump in and say, as someone who's based in Jersey City, what we call the 6th borough of New York, I think the data is still too early to really show that, but there are definitely, the tendency is growing and it's solidifying. So if you speak with real estate lawyers, if you speak with developers, I have a very dear friend who has a law office, and he only does real estate closings, like mortgage closings and purchasing and some rental stuff. And in preparation for a discussion today, I spoke with him last week. His business and all his other colleagues in this area are going through the roof. He's based about an hour south of New York, in a very nice part of the Jersey Shore, these two sort of sister counties called Monmouth, Ocean County. And his business is maximized, and so is that of many other real estate-based law firms. And that's maybe part of urban policy that we don't look at is, where can we see other indicators? And when in urban policy do we go to real estate lawyers and ask them about what they're seeing and what their clients are seeing? So I just wanted to address one of those questions from the chat before. And Angie, is there a question? Looks like we have Wolfram there. Do we have a question that we can direct to Wolfram? Now we welcome him back.
I'm sure we can do that. Wolfram, there's a question about municipal government in the United States with some dysfunctionality politically that can stall change and improvement. In your work, do you have any ideas about how this can be overcome?
Well, actually, the local activists are an important role. The nonprofit, the NGOs, the non-government organization like Sustainability is one of these organizations that helps and supports local activists to be the advocates of environment. The really overcoming would mean a gigantic political reform of changing the 2-year election cycle for a local municipality, or a 2-year election cycle for a county administration. When every 2 years there's a vote, then you have your kind of permanent campaigning mode, and there's never a time when you can actually get things done. So that would be a bigger thing. But I believe that the NGO community has a strong role in doing it. And actually that's what's happening, that a lot of municipal tasks that in Germany, for example, would be municipal tasks are taken on by the NGO community. That was one of the lessons learned when I came over here.
So I'd like to add to that point. I believe it was it must have been Ban Ki-moon, former General Secretary of the United Nations, very emblematic of the shift on how you get things done. I mean, we used to always look at federal governments, national governments, Congress, Senate, and this is an interesting thing that is one of the main pillars of the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction and urban resilience, and that is looking at these subnational actors, and Wolfram brings up civil society. It was, I'm fairly sure it was the prior Secretary General said, if you want to get something done, don't call a prime minister's office, call a mayor. If you really want to effectuate some change, go to the local level. Josh, can we get your impressions on that, since you brought up this question of federal funding and versus municipal capacity?
Sure. I mean, I think you're reminding us of Pete Buttigieg's main sort of campaign slogan, which is like local mayors and governments know how to get things done, and they do. So,
and Mike Bloomberg's lack of using that message, by the way.
That's right. So I don't know, like the dysfunction of local government, that feels like a lot to unpack. I do sort of like feel that, you know, one of the things that you sort of just mentioned was this idea of explicitly including local advocacy groups as part of the planning process. You know, in the kind of projects that I work on, which are generally like urban master planning type developments, a lot of times there's an instinct to sort of use a framework like LEAD or something like that, or and increasingly people, I don't know about increasingly, but one of the things that people look at is eco districts out of Portland. And one of the pillars that they've always had is this idea of resilience, that, and sort of to go back to your what happened to the Rockefeller Foundation, or sort of what may have sort of like spurred that, this idea of broadening the way that we think about resilience from very like post-Hurricane Sandy type of climate adaptation to broader kind of social resilience. And the explicit component of equity, which we haven't touched on as much as I think we could have, but one of the reasons is it's hard to do that. And their approach to it is to say, we can't define what equity and resilience looks like for your project. You need to explicitly bring in sort of a local advocacy group to help you, to essentially help you do that, to sort of bring in a different perspective, which is not something that I think people are generally comfortable with. So I would sort of say on two sides, you have local governments, which I think are generally effective at sort of doing the things that they do. And the things that they grapple with are sort of like how to sort of like manage all the voices that they hear from. If you go to a city council hearing, it can be a little chaotic. So the idea of identifying you know, community groups that really are sort of representative of what that community needs, I think is something that every municipality ought to be sort of engaged in. And then, you know, on the other side, they always sort of deal with, again, like a lack of funding for infrastructure, and are constantly sort of looking for, you know, state funding or municipal funding to sort of be able to sort of drive some of the things that we are interested in green infrastructure. And that just feels like such a lost opportunity when things like roads function in a very sort of different way in terms of funding. So I think, you know, if I'm a city and I want to sort of be more effective at this, I kind of like look in both directions, you know, upstream for sort of funding and resources, and downstream to sort of like better be equipped to sort of hear from those voices to hopefully sort of, and again, not just put in green infrastructure, but do so in a way with a kind of an equity lens associated with it.
So we have, let's just take maybe 30 seconds while we still have Wolfram here. You raised your hand, Wolfram, a quick rebuttal or a confirmation, or what do you think?
Actually, a very quick rebuttal in a way that for us who do community engagement, we need to widen our perspective to not only include the usual suspects, when you usually have the white
looks like we'll have to end it on the usual suspects. Yeah, we lost the sound quality there, Wolfram, unfortunately. So we've come to the end of our discussion today. I'd like to hand the floor back to Peter Rosenbaum for today's conclusion. Off you go, Peter.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you so much, Angie, for co-hosting this event. Thank you, Sebastian, Josh, Wolfram. So Wolfram, your last words were don't call the usual suspects. That's one of the takeaway lessons. Another one, call your mayor if you want to change things, if you want to get things done. I think this was a really wonderful conversation. We will make a recording of this conversation available on our websites, on the ICLEI website and UA Ruhr website, as well as the website of the German Center for Research and Innovation. We are going to take a well-deserved summer break, but continue with this webinar on the future of our cities in the fall on topics such as logistics, transportation, public space. So please do check our websites, do come back. And I want to hand it over to Ben, who wants to say a final word.
Let me just say thank you so much. I was following this exciting discussion, and I believe this is really a highlight of our virtual events so far. And I believe I still see we have a big number of audience people participating.
Perfect. Thank you all so very much. Sorry about the technical glitches, that always happens, but thank you. Have a wonderful day. Bye bye.
Thank you all. Bye now.
Everyone. Thanks everybody.